Welcome to Congress in Context. Right now, 1,500 Coast Guard personnel down in Houston, Texas are currently working without pay.
Right.
And, while that's happening, just a few states over, an Alabama mining company is, well, effectively triggering an international trade war with Mexico.
Yeah. It's a lot happening at once.
It really is. And today we actually have the exact paperwork that connects these seemingly chaotic, disconnected dots. We're taking the really dense, formalized proceedings of the United States Congress and synthesizing them to find the actual pulse of the nation.
Exactly.
So the goal of this deep dive is to take what happens on the House floor and make it relevant to your local community, to your commute, and really to your understanding of how power actually operates. Our source material today is the literal congressional record for Friday, March 27, 2026.
And, the record is essentially the unfiltered diary of the American government. I mean, it captures absolutely everything.
Oh, completely.
Yeah, so today we're going to examine both the highly public, fiery floor debates, the ones that, generate all the cable news headlines, and the much quieter, formalized extensions of remarks section.
Which is so interesting.
It is. That's where a significant amount of the real localized representation actually occurs. But before we get into the mechanics of these debates, we have to set a very firm ground rule for you, the listener.
We absolutely do. Because honestly, today's record is intense, and we need to be really clear about how we're approaching it.
Right. Today's congressional record involves incredibly heated, highly partisan debates regarding border security, immigration enforcement, and foreign relations.
Heavy stuff.
Very heavy. So our job today is strictly and impartially to report on the viewpoints presented by both Republicans and Democrats in this official record. We are not taking sides. We're not endorsing either viewpoint. Our sole mission is to just convey the raw ideas and the underlying arguments exactly as they were delivered on the House floor. We want to give you the objective context necessary to understand the mechanics of our government, regardless of where you stand politically.
Perfect. So let's dive into the biggest clash of the day. The gravitational center of the House floor was H.R. 7147. That's the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act of 2026.
Right, the big one.
Yeah. And more specifically, they were debating the procedural rule for it, which is HRS 1142. So the House had a procedural vote, which actually passed 213 to 203 to concur with the Senate amendment.
Okay.
But then the House added their own amendment to fund the Department of Homeland Security through May 22, 2026. Basically, they engineered an 8-week continuing resolution. And I mean, all of this is happening right in the middle of a 42-day partial government shutdown.
Wow. Yeah, and the mechanism of a continuing resolution, or a CR, is crucial to understand here. Because a CR doesn't just keep the lights on, right? It legally freezes an agency's spending at the exact levels and priorities of the previous fiscal year.
So they can't change anything.
Exactly. Agencies generally despise continuing resolutions because it acts as like a budgetary straitjacket. You cannot start new programs, you can't easily shift funds to address emergent crises,
Right.
and you can't cancel old contracts. It's strictly a stopgap measure. And the partisan divide over this specific stopgap is as stark as it gets.
Okay, let's look at the Republican argument first. This was led on the floor by Representative Michelle Fischbach of Minnesota and Representative Austin Scott of Georgia.
Right.
They argued forcefully that the bipartisan funding bill sent over by the Senate was an absolute non-starter. And their reasoning hinged on a very specific reading of the text. They argued the Senate version zeroed out specific necessary funding for Customs and Border Protection CBP and ICE operations.
Yeah, Republican lawmakers built their argument on the premise that accepting the Senate bill would essentially mandate an entirely open border.
Wow.
And they anchored this policy stance with highly specific, tragic examples. On the floor, they cited the recent murders of American citizens by undocumented immigrants.
Right, they actually named them in the record, didn't they?
They did, specifically naming Sheridan Gorman, Richard Williams, Stephanie Minter, and Laken Riley into the official record.
Okay, so they were pointing to these horrific events as absolute proof that ICE needs its full funding restored immediately, without any restrictions.
Precisely. Their core argument was that an 8-week continuing resolution is the only responsible path forward to keep the entire Department of Homeland Security open and functioning, without, as Representative Fischbach described it, leaving the back door wide open.
I see.
From their perspective on the floor, passing the Senate bill meant prioritizing compromise over immediate national security.
Okay, so then you look at the other side of the aisle, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Democratic response was spearheaded by Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York.
Right.
And they accused the Republicans of purposefully prolonging a 42-day shutdown. They focused heavily on the collateral damage of the standoff, like pointing out that TSA agents, FEMA workers, and Coast Guard personnel are currently being forced to work without pay.
Right. And the Democrats' perspective on the Senate bill itself was fundamentally different. They argued that the Senate bill wasn't some radical fringe document, but rather a unanimous bipartisan compromise that had already cleared the Republican-controlled Senate.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and furthermore, they heavily criticized the Republican push for more ICE funding by really scrutinizing the agency's current balance sheet.
Right. Democrats on the floor claim that ICE already operates with an $85 billion budget. And within that, they pointed to a $75 billion allocation that they characterized as a slush fund.
Which is an important procedural term to unpack here.
Yeah. What does that actually mean in this context?
Well, in congressional budgeting, referring to something as a slush fund usually means the money is highly discretionary. The Democrats are arguing that ICE has tens of billions of dollars that are not strictly earmarked for specific, transparent operations.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, giving the agency massive leeway to operate without sufficient oversight or accountability.
Okay. And the Democrats also anchored their policy arguments with specific human tragedies to justify their demand for accountability.
They did, yeah.
They cited instances of ICE agents allegedly abusing and even killing U.S. citizens, specifically naming Renee Good and Alex Pretty on the floor. So they used these examples to argue that additional unrestricted funding shouldn't be granted to the agency without major sweeping reforms.
Yeah, so it is a profound philosophical and operational clash playing out in real time. You have one side arguing that the agency is the thin blue line essential for immediate public safety, and the other side arguing that the agency in its current unregulated form is an active threat to public safety.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Let's try to visualize the mechanics of this standoff, because the causality here is almost absurd.
Yeah, it really is.
It's like two roommates arguing while their house is actively on fire. One roommate refuses to pay the water bill until they get a brand new state-of-the-art security system installed, while the other roommate insists they just need to turn the fire hose on right now to stop the burning. And, they can argue about the security system later.
That's a great way to put it.
But the craziest part of this scenario is that while they're arguing in the kitchen, they've locked the actual firefighters outside the house. And we actually see those locked out firefighters in the record, don't we?
We do, very clearly. If you want to see how this high-level Washington standoff hits everyday Americans, you have to read Representative Texas Menefee's floor speech.
Oh, right, from Texas.
Yeah, he represents Houston, Texas, and he brought this massive national standoff right down to the ZIP code level.
Yeah, he pointed out that Houston is home to Bush Intercontinental Airport, which is currently experiencing massive TSA wait times and really high employee call-out rates. Yeah. And why? Because those agents aren't getting paid. They literally cannot afford the gas to drive to work to screen passengers.
Exactly. And he also noted that Sector Houston Galveston is home to a U.S. Coast Guard base with more than 1,500 personnel.
1,500?
Right. Those are 1,500 people in one local community going without paychecks while actively securing the waterways. It perfectly illustrates your analogy. The high-level philosophical debate in D.C. translates directly into missed mortgage payments, airport chaos, and unfunded Coast Guardsmen in a specific district.
It totally pulls the entire debate out of the abstract. Now, speaking of the abstract, so much of what happens in Congress is dictated by procedural rules that seem entirely invisible to the public.
Oh, absolutely.
To really understand the congressional record, you have to understand the procedural chess game that dictates the final outcome. During this DHS debate, there was a massive procedural moment centered around something called the motion to order the previous question.
Yes.
My understanding is this is basically a vote on whether to stop talking and force a final vote, right?
That is exactly what it is. Ordering the previous question is a parliamentary maneuver to end debate and move immediately to voting on the main issue at hand. It's the primary tool the majority party uses to say, we are done discussing this, let's vote on our plan.
Right.
But here is the critical procedural trick. If the minority party, in this case the Democrats, can successfully organize, vote against the previous question, and actually defeat it, they get to seize control of the floor agenda.
Oh, wow. So it's a legislative hijack maneuver.
Exactly.
If they win that procedural vote, they just take the steering wheel away from the majority.
Precisely. And Representative McGovern explicitly urged his Democratic colleagues to vote against the previous question for exactly this reason.
Oh, so he was saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah. If the Democrats had won that seemingly obscure procedural vote, their plan was to hijack the floor and force an immediate up or down vote on the bipartisan Senate funding bill that they preferred, completely bypassing the Republicans' 8-week continuing resolution.
But the Republican majority held the line. The House voted 209 to 206 to order the previous question. So by winning that vote, Republicans immediately shut down the Democratic hijacking maneuver and forced the vote on their preferred continuing resolution.
Just think about the margins of power there.
Well,
A 3-vote difference on a procedural motion completely changed the trajectory of the Department of Homeland Security's funding.
that's wild. 3 votes.
Right. If 2 members had been stuck in traffic, the entire domestic security apparatus might have been funded differently. That is why you'll often hear political strategists obsess over the rules of the House. The real battle often isn't the final vote on a bill, it's the procedural votes that dictate which bill is even allowed to exist on the floor.
It's the invisible architecture of power. I mean, we just saw how a 3-vote margin can paralyze an entire domestic department. But if you flip ahead a few pages in today's record, you find a moment where 247 members suddenly link arms to wield a massive international economic lever.
Yeah, quite a shift.
Right. We transition from this deep, bitter partisan divide over Homeland Security to a striking moment of bipartisanship with H.R. $7.84. That's the Defending American Property Abroad Act of 2026. This bill passed with a solid majority, 247 to 164.
This is a deeply fascinating piece of legislation because it sits right at the intersection of international trade, private property rights, and foreign relations.
Okay, so what's the background here?
Well, the core issue revolves around a United States business called Vulcan Materials Company. They have operated a deepwater port and a limestone quarry in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico since 1986.
Right, but recently, the Mexican government utilized its military to physically shut down and expropriate that port and quarry. They effectively seized the property of an American company using armed forces.
Which naturally brought out some very strong defenders in Congress. Representative August Pfluger of Texas sponsored the bill, and Representative Terry Sewell of Alabama, along with several other Alabama lawmakers, were aggressively supporting it.
Which makes sense.
Right, when you look at the geography, it makes perfect sense. Vulcan Materials is headquartered in Alabama. These representatives were stepping up to defend a major employer and economic driver in their home state.
But what really caught my eye is the mechanism they designed in this bill. The retaliation isn't just a sternly worded letter.
No, not at all.
The bill authorizes the President of the United States to deny U.S. port entry to any vessels that utilize a port in the Western Hemisphere that was illegally seized from a U.S. citizen.
The logistics of that are staggering if you think about it. It effectively turns the U.S. Coast Guard and port authorities into international property enforcers.
Wow.
If a commercial shipping conglomerate decides to dock a vessel at that stolen Mexican port to load up on limestone, that specific vessel is now legally blacklisted from docking in Miami or Los Angeles or Seattle. It forces global shipping companies to choose between doing business with the expropriated Mexican port or doing business with the entire United States of America.
It is an incredibly aggressive economic lever, but, it wasn't universally loved. Even though defending an American company from military seizure seems like an easy political win, there was notable opposition.
Right.
Representative Rick Larson of Washington and Representative Chu Garcia of Illinois both voted against it.
And their opposition really highlights the complex, unintended consequences of foreign policy. They argued that this bill places an unfunded and incredibly heavy new burden on the U.S. Coast Guard.
The same Coast Guard we just talked about.
Exactly. Remember, this is the same Coast Guard that is already strained tracking illegal fishing, intercepting drug smuggling, and dealing with unpaid personnel in Houston. Now, this bill mandates they police international commercial property disputes by tracking complex global shipping manifests.
Oh man, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And they also raised concerns about executive overreach. arguing that it gives the president overly broad international authority that could, be abused in the future.
Right.
And finally, they pointed out that the Mexican government claimed they seized the quarry due to local environmental concerns. And the opposition felt this bill totally ignores the sovereign rights of foreign nations to protect their own environments.
It perfectly illustrates how pulling one lever to protect a mining business in Alabama suddenly gives the Coast Guard in Washington state a massive, incredibly complex new mandate. Everything in the federal government is interconnected.
So we have the Coast Guard unfunded in Houston and simultaneously being handed a massive new international mandate regarding Mexican ports. That is the macro-level chaos of the floor.
It really is.
But the congressional record also reveals how representatives use their power not just for national legislation, but for quiet, localized amplification. Let's flip to the very back of the record, to a section called the extensions of remarks.
The extensions of remarks is a vital contrast to everything we've discussed so far. While the House floor is built for national-level combat, debate, and posturing, the extension section allows lawmakers to submit formal, written remarks directly into the official historical congressional record.
Right.
These statements are not read aloud on camera. They are quietly etched into the permanent history of the United States. They're highly localized, very personal, and often incredibly revealing about the realities of the job.
Reading through them from March 27th gives you a completely different view of what a representative actually does all day. Let's look at a few of these, strictly using the official phrasing that defines this unique section of the record. So, while not spoken on the floor, Representative Jared Moskowitz of Florida submitted a statement emphasizing that he missed the crucial DHS shutdown votes because he had to return home for his wife's surgery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, though he made sure to note for the official record that he would have voted nay.
Think about the bizarre political reality behind that submission. He is forced to put his spouse's private medical emergency into the permanent historical record of the United States government simply to create a paper trail to preempt future political attack ads that might accuse him of skipping a crucial national security vote.
That's wild.
It heavily grounds the political and the personal.
It really does. Here's another striking one. While not spoken on the floor, Representative Susie Lee of Nevada submitted a statement emphasizing the severe health care provider shortages in southern Nevada, doing so in honor of Area Health Education Centers Week.
Okay.
And then she submitted a second statement celebrating Temple Beth Sholom's 80th anniversary in her district.
The juxtaposition there is fascinating. On page 1 of the record, you have debates over global trade wars and constitutional funding crises. And 50 pages later, a representative is putting the struggles of her local healthcare system and the 80th birthday of a local synagogue into the permanent historical archive.
Yeah.
It highlights the absolute duality of being a representative. You're expected to manage global crises and simultaneously celebrate local milestones.
It's how they tether themselves to the people back home. And here's another one. While not spoken on the floor, Representative Stephen F. Lynch of Massachusetts submitted a statement emphasizing the historic commissioning of the USS Massachusetts nuclear submarine in Boston Harbor.
See, that is a pure expression of state pride. It's a representative taking massive, abstract federal defense spending and connecting it directly back to the local harbor where the actual shipyard jobs are located.
Exactly. And finally, this one might be my favorite. While not spoken on the floor, Representative Joseph D. Morell of New York submitted a statement emphasizing the local efforts of Debbie Evans, a woman fighting child poverty and food insecurity in Rochester.
That is perhaps the most striking contrast in the entire document. You have billions of dollars being debated on the floor, threats of open borders, government shutdowns, and procedural hijackings.
Right.
And yet, in the quiet pages of the extensions, a representative is utilizing the machinery of the United States government to ensure that a local woman running a clothing and food exchange for poor children is recognized by history.
It proves that while cable news focuses almost entirely on the screaming matches, the procedural drama, and the viral moments, a massive portion of a representative's job is quietly honoring the specific industries, groups, and individuals in their districts. The extensions of remarks are the actual connective tissue between the Capitol building and the local community.
Evaluating these extensions alongside the floor debates really challenges our baseline perception of Congress. It forces us to ask a difficult question.
What's that?
When we evaluate whether our government is truly working, do we give far too much weight to the performative, partisan clashes captured on the cameras of the House floor? And in doing so, are we entirely ignoring the quiet, localized, and often bipartisan work buried in the written text of the congressional record? Ultimately, which part of this record truly reflects the state of the union?
That is the perfect, provocative thought to leave you with today. Is the true nature of our government the fire on the floor or the quiet honors in the back pages? Transparency is the only way to answer that for yourself. You can look up every single piece of legislation we discussed, the exact roll call votes, the procedural motions, and the full congressional record for today's date, March 27, 2026, by visiting congress.gov.
Yeah, go read the raw debate.
Exactly. Look up your own representative's extensions of remarks. Find out exactly what they're putting into the historical record on your behalf.
It is the ultimate tool for an informed citizen to bypass the noise and see the actual mechanics of the state.
It really is. Thank you for joining us and taking this deep dive into the context of Congress. Remember, the next time you see politicians arguing on television about the metaphorical house being on fire, take a moment to look up the paperwork they filed in the back office and see if they lock the firefighters out in the process. You might be surprised by what you find. We'll see you next time.